Hey everyone, welcome to episode 3 of Games as a Product podcast. My name is Feng, I'm with my friend Kyle, and this is a podcast where we as gamers and product managers talk about the business and the product management of different gaming products. In the past, we've talked about specific games and AAA publishing, but today we're doing something slightly different. We're going to talk about gaming hardware. Kyle, do you want to introduce our topic?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the things that's become pretty popular and more mainstream over the past few years is the handheld gaming PC space. The real impetus for this explosion in the space was Valve announcing and releasing the Steam Deck, which is a portable handheld PC that integrates with their store, and you can play generally the vast majority of the Steam library on it fairly easily. One of the interesting things about this is not only does Valve have hardware, but they also have a store. But we're also seeing competitors like Lenovo and Asus launch similar PCs in the space. They don't have a store, right? These are purely hardware companies. So, one of the things I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about the strategy from Valve's standpoint, what they're looking to do, what they're hoping to get out of this, and maybe what some of the competitors are looking to get out of this, because these potentially are two very different business strategies and business models that have manifested in three very similar looking products.
Valve is the company that made Steam Deck, and Valve's primary product is the Steam Store, which is the number one market share store for PC games. And now they're expanding into the hardware market, right? And this isn't the first time Valve has done this. On the screen, I'm showing this article, but it tells the history of Valve working on other gaming hardware products that weren't so successful, and now they finally found something that's kind of working. Would you say?
Absolutely. So just for a little bit of context on the history of Valve's hardware, they've done a number of things in the past. So one of the initiatives that they had done maybe about 10 years ago was called the Steam Machine. So this was a Linux based, essentially a home console the idea was that you would connect it to your TV and play it with a Steam controller, which they had designed. One of the issues that they ran into was they didn't necessarily design and build the hardware themselves. They actually worked with a number of other hardware partners to create these Steam machines. And so one of the lessons that they said that they had learned over time is, okay, well, if we're going to go build any more hardware, we need to be in control, because the hardware partners didn't necessarily put forth the maximum effort to making these things successful, because obviously they were already successful in making more traditional Windows PCs and high-end things. There was also another product called the Steam Link, which again was another product that connected to your television. And the goal there was that you would stream your PC to the Steam Link locally within your house or apartment. But those were all kind of superseded, I think, by the rise of streaming platforms like Amazon Fire TV and Apple TV.
I wonder if the past failures is a result of not picking the correct gaming product. And the reason I say this is I was just looking at the best-selling gaming consoles by units sold, and 3 out of the top 5 are handhelds: the DS, the Switch, and the Game Boy Color. The handheld market has a history of success, and so that is a safer product category to get into. I'm wondering if Valve basically chose the wrong hardware product category to get into in the first place. Then they just decided that, handhelds is just a safe choice. It has an established history of success, and let's make our own. Do you think that's the case?
I think that's an interesting point you raise. I mean, one of the things about handhelds that makes them successful, I think, is that they are generally less expensive than your home console, right? Going back to the days of the Game Boy and the DS, those things were clearly less expensive, especially at launch, when compared with the prevailing home consoles at the time, which tended to retail for generally at least $100 or $200 more. Handhelds are sometimes used as kids' first gaming consoles. So, if you have multiple kids, maybe you want to get them each a Game Boy so that they don't fight over it, or there's no disagreements, things like that. Steam's distribution is all digital, and it has been since the start, right? And I think that's helped enable them to think about even entering into the handheld space. So I think the advent of digital distribution also helped Valve decide, hey, maybe we can move into the space now because you don't necessarily have to be tethered to a bulky box to have a AAA experience on the go.
The success of the Nintendo Switch and the success of mobile games in general, right, on phones, have paved the way for the Steam Deck to be a potentially successful product. One thing I want to explore is why a software company like Valve would want to get into hardware business in the first place. From business school, one of the things that they talk about a lot is vertical integration. That seems like the very easy cop-out answer, right? If you own all parts of the gaming experience in the gaming ecosystem, that can solidify your market share and your customer base. The main strategy here is creating a deeper and wider moat. If Valve were to create a awesome hardware experience, but that's also dependent on the Steam store, that makes the switching cost much higher for players. Players are sort of locked into the Steam store ecosystem because they're also engaging with Valve's hardware.
The Steam Deck by no means prevents you from installing competing third-party stores on the product itself. It is really a PC, and the Linux to Windows translation layer known as Proton functions just the same with those third-party stores as it does with Valve's own games. But those third-party games, it's never as easily integrated into the Steam Deck as a game that you would buy from Valve or Steam itself. You have the convenience of things like cloud saves that, essentially generally comes with a game on Steam Deck that lets you go between. If you have a desktop or a laptop that you're playing on, you shut that down, you hop over to your Steam Deck.
Yeah, it's very similar to the iOS App Store, where you basically know that everything within the App Store works well on your iPhone. Similarly, with the Steam Store, you can trust the games that you buy and play on the Steam Store to work well on your Steam Deck.
Yeah, and they've gone out of their way to implement a testing program. This has kind of become Valve's business practice. I think they've got a lot of goodwill from consumers because they've done a lot in the PC gaming space to bring it back from the brink of almost irrelevancy. When Steam came in and started becoming more of a store, once people got over the fact that, yes, it is a bit of DRM, they started seeing value in the features that Steam was bringing to them. And I believe that they're using that goodwill to kind of help propel sales on their store, right? And the Steam Deck is no different. Like you were saying earlier, Fang, it really is an extension of how can we make these things user-friendly.
It's not cheap to create a new Linux distribution, right? Valve basically created SteamOS to work well with the Steam Deck. And it's also not cheap to create Proton, which is an emulation layer on top of Linux to play Windows games. But Valve still invested so much development time and money into this to ensure the best gaming experience on their handheld machine, which is the Steam Deck. And a very common complaint about Steam Deck's competitors in Asus and Lenovo is that they're just using Windows, and because they don't have a proprietary user experience, it's just not as good as using Steam Deck.
Windows is just not necessarily designed for a handheld touchscreen experience, right? They've tried to play in that space before, but that focus kind of fell away after I believe it was Windows 8, which was more touchscreen focused. But actually, the interesting thing you brought up about Proton is why did they invest in Proton? And this actually goes back to Windows 8. But Gabe Newell, who is the head of Valve, was expressing his concern that when Microsoft launched their App Store, that there was a very strong temptation for Microsoft to close off Windows from what had been a very open platform to this very closed platform, right? And as a third-party storefront, he was very concerned about that. And so that's where he started thinking, okay, well, hey, maybe we should look into decoupling ourselves from that and investigating Linux, because Linux is open source. When you look at the performance of certain games on Steam Deck versus the more powerful rivals, it actually games run a little bit better on Steam Deck, just because you don't have that additional overhead that Windows is introducing.
Yeah, I was actually watching a video of a handheld that was on Windows, and the reviewer was showing that the Windows install also had Microsoft Office, which makes no sense. Why would you want Microsoft Office on your handheld gaming machine? But that's just part of the whole package that Windows comes with. Yeah, I really think that, going with the analogy of iOS and SteamOS, even though SteamOS is not as strict and walled off as iOS is, it seems to me that Valve in general is creating a very curated user experience and making sure that the software and the hardware just matches up perfectly.
For sure. And I think part of that is they also want to open up the Steam store to beyond the traditional audience that they have of enthusiasts, right? Because when you think of PC gamers, you think of these are mid-range and higher systems that people are gaming on, and those don't come inexpensively, right? And I know that the Steam Deck comes in three different configurations, including one that's at $399, which Gabe Newell was quoted as saying it was very painful to get to that price, right? So the implication is that they're either not making very much money on it or they're losing money on that, probably to help really broaden and grow that audience.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to talk about Steam Deck's competitors, do a compare and contrast. What I'm showing you on my screen right now is a chart that shows the specs, the price of Steam Deck versus the Lenovo Legion Go and the Asus ROG Ally. And just from a really quick glance, the Steam Deck is easily the least powerful out of all the machines.
I think you're seeing that now. For when it first came out about a year and a half ago, I don't think it was a big issue. But now with games that are coming out that are more in tune with console specs, you're seeing some of the limitations with especially some of the newer AAA games. But that's not to say that the ROG Ally and Legion Go. Now, Legion Go at the time of this recording is not available yet. Talking about the ROG Ally, one of the things that I've heard is it doesn't necessarily run those AAA games as well as you would hope either, despite it being a little bit more powerful. And one of the big issues that you have is with a higher resolution screen that does 120 hertz, that actually hurts your battery life. It's taking what's already a limited battery life and shrinking it down because you're putting more powerful hardware in this handheld device.
Yeah, I think this is sort of like a case of each company playing to their advantage. So Valve is a software company going to hardware. Their software is going to be better optimized for whatever hardware they use. On the other hand, Asus and Lenovo, they're hardware companies, and that's what they specialize in. And so they're basically pushing a competitive advantage on the hardware front by having better specs. And with the Lenovo Legion Go, they even have this very interesting vertical mouse feature with the controller. So they're adding these hardware components that really Steam Deck can't compete with directly. But like you said, with battery life, for example, Valve is able to optimize better, right? And especially they have a sort of this low power, low refresh mode where you can play arcade games. When you play on this low power mode, you can play for a long time. So you can have a really good experience with these lower requirement games.
Asus and Lenovo are definitely hardware companies, and they're leveraging that expertise, right? And this goes back to what I was talking about a little bit when we opened this discussion, that I think the reasons that they've come to market are because they see an opportunity in this space that has been opened up by Valve. These more traditional hardware companies are seeing this opportunity and saying, okay, well, what can we bring to the table? Obviously, they're not able to match the price, but I don't necessarily think that's the goal, right? I think they're trying to be more premium. And especially in the case of the Legion Go, I mean, it has, a 2560 by 1600 screen, which to me is almost overkill for the size of the device. But it also has, detachable Nintendo Switch-like controllers on either side of it. Taking a handheld and saying, well, you don't even have to hold it in your hand. You can detach the controllers and stick the rest of the device on the table so you don't have to hold it, because these things are heavy. I almost wonder what does this look like in 5 years, right? Is this still a space that these companies are playing in? And if so, what form factor are these things taking?
Yeah, so I have some predictions. I can't help but think that this is a different version of Android versus Apple, where Steam Deck is the Apple iPhone and all the other competitors are the different Android devices. Basically, Valve and Steam Deck is playing to the advantage of having the best user experience while not having the best specs. And the Android of handhelds, right, the Lenovo's and the Asus, they are trying to win users over with the best and latest hardware tech. And if you sort of look at the history of Android and iOS, right, in this current day and age, both ecosystems are very strong, right? And I think that's the future as well. Eventually, we'll have really strong competitors to Steam Deck. But if you look at sort of the early days of Android and iOS, iPhones were the best phone out there because Apple was able to figure out the best smartphone experience. But eventually, Android was able to get to a point where the user experience wasn't so bad anymore, wasn't so buggy. And now the latest Samsung phones are as good, if not better than iPhones. Which kind of brings me to my last point, which is very interesting, is that we've reached a point in the Android iPhone market where it's really hard to argue that iPhones are better. But the thing is, most people still stick with iPhones because they've stuck with iPhones forever. And I'm wondering if the same thing will happen to Steam Deck, where Steam Deck has essentially already won over the loyalty of many users. So that's kind of my outlook. What do you think?
Maybe it evolves into the case, maybe it's not like iPhone and Android. Maybe it's more akin to a phone versus a tablet. Maybe the Steam Deck stays as a pure handheld device, where some of these, Asus and Lenovo start playing more in the gaming laptop space by making it bigger, making it, a little bit more powerful, and not worrying about being able to carry it around necessarily in the same way that you might a Steam Deck, right? So it could potentially evolve in that direction too, because these companies have lines of ultra powerful PCs. So I think there's a lot of exciting things to come in this space, and hey, maybe we wind up with basically the Windows Surface Pro of gaming, right, where it can be both a laptop and a portable, depending on what mode you want to use it in.
Another article that I came across, right, that's very interesting is that Valve is not iterating on the Steam Deck very fast. It seems like their product lifecycle for the Steam Deck is 3 years, maybe even 4 years. I can't help but think that within that time period, Valve's competitors are going to innovate and iterate much faster. So this is what makes me think that Valve is prioritizing the software experience over the hardware, right? They're not racing the competitors to put out the latest hardware. They're just going to upgrade when there are substantial upgrades, but they're not always chasing the cutting edge. And they're just relying on their ecosystem to keep players engaged in between the upgrade cycles.
They are definitely prioritizing that user experience. I mean, when you think about, the ROG Ally, what I've heard from people who have them is that they are definitely not as user friendly as the Steam Deck. But one of the interesting things is that Valve, they're targeting a very console-like ecosystem from what I'm understanding, right? This article specifically says, hey, they want to make sure that the Steam Deck has a very fixed target for developers, which is exactly what, say a Nintendo or a Sony might do with their consoles, where they're not necessarily as powerful as the cutting-edge PCs that, these developers are targeting for their higher end visuals and performance targets, but they are fixed and they know what cuts they have to make. They can make those, they can test and refine some of their code and their processes to make sure that when you have the game running on this fixed hardware, say the Steam Deck in this case, it's going to be performant. So Steam Deck can punch above its weight because you're not necessarily dealing with many, many different configurations. You've got one thing that these developers can target to say, okay, well,
and it's very smart, right? Valve is telling developers that this is what you can expect for the next 3 years. Having that knowledge mitigates a lot of risk for developers and makes developers want to create more games for the Steam Deck because they know what to expect for the next 3 years. Which again makes me think that Valve really is trying to double down on its platform and ecosystem advantage. They're trying to be both the most user-friendly, but also like the most developer-friendly with this strategy.
I think this was a big proof of concept for them. I think if Valve had found out that the market wasn't receptive to the Steam Deck, they would just kind of shut it down. And I would personally think that their kind of ambitions and hardware would have gone by the wayside at that point. But now that they're seeing this, they went in expecting, I don't know what they were expecting numbers wise, but I think what they're selling is above that, or at least trending on the very high end of their expectations. So for the next iteration of the Steam Deck, they might be able to go more powerful, right? They might be able to use more powerful components rather than kind of sticking with last gen AMD processor and say, okay, well, hey, we're going to try to future proof this so that even if we're only going to put one out every 3 years, it's still going to have performance that people are expecting. And you're going to get buy-in from their hardware partners. You're going to get buy-in from the developers. So I'm really, really excited for the next iteration of the Steam Deck personally.
Yeah, I wonder if like basically Asus and Lenovo aren't really the companies that Valve should be scared of, right? It's really Valve versus Nintendo that's going to come up, fighting for who has the best handheld user experience, right? The best economics, the best platforms, and the best games.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true of a lot of different marketplaces out there, a lot of different consumer spaces, right? Who can provide the best experience? Who can provide it in the right form factor? Who can provide it for the right price? And I agree with you. I mean, I think Nintendo may be more of a competitor to these devices moving forward.
I think this kind of wraps up our discussion for the Steam Deck. Do you have any final thoughts?
Like I said, I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to see where this evolves. And it could even be the case that portable gaming might start to supersede some of these more stationary versions of entertainment, right? There's always going to be people who value power and who want to wring out every last frame and all that. But I think the bigger market, especially, with people gaming on smartphones and things like that, is receptive to portable devices, to smaller screens, to things that fit into their life a little bit more than having to sit down and do appointment gaming, right? It's almost like when we moved from watching linear TV or cable to streaming, where, hey, if you want to catch up on an episode of something on Netflix while you're waiting at the doctor's office, you can do it. And I think these devices may have an opportunity to change some consumer behavior. Maybe they'll even start to pull gamers away who feel like they've experienced what they want to experience on mobile. They've enjoyed their time with these games. Well, what's the next step up, right? What's a higher quality thing that I can do? Oh, portable gaming. Might be with Valve, might be with Nintendo, might be with some of these other manufacturers, but it's a logical thought to think that people might want to invest more.
Devices like the Switch and devices like the Steam Deck definitely fit in that interesting middle ground between mobile phone gamers and PC and console gamers. And we'll just have to see how big that market is. So the next few years are definitely going to be very interesting. Thanks for chatting with me today, and thanks for watching. See you guys next time.